Hello, everyone. Nice to have you. Welcome to our today's webinar series, Global Migration Governance at Crossroads, the narrative of global responsibility and its legal and ethical implications. This webinar series has been coordinated by three ISA sections, namely ethnicity, nationalism, migration studies, and MISA sections, international ethics section, as well as international law sections. Our webinar series seeks to explore, just as a reminder, if you have followed our previous sessions, you have learned that we want to explore the narrative of global responsibility along with solidarity and sanctuary practices, not only as a moral imperative, but also as a complex legal and ethical construct. Central to our discussion have been and remain two critical questions. What are the limits of a global responsibility towards refugees? And how are those limits transcended at the meso-institutional and individual community levels? Through a multidisciplinary lens, we will examine how international legal obligations, state sovereignty, and humanitarian principles intersect and sometimes collide. And today, unlike our previous sections, we'll have three panelists and two discussants to tackle the issues what we are going to talk about. I am Miaoling Hasenkamp, based at Rostock University in Germany. I'm the chair. We are chairing the whole sessions. Nice to have all of you join us. And then we have three panelists and two discussants. Before we start with panelists, I will first introduce our two discussants. The first discussant will be Alexandria Innes, who is based at the University of London, City St. George School of Policy and Global Affairs. And our second discussion will be Hans Schettel from the Yonsei University Department of Political Science. Now we go directly to our first panelist today, George Andropoulos. He is a professor of political science at John Kay College of Criminal Justice and at the Graduate Center Connie, and the founding director of the Center of International Human Rights at John Kay College. He has written extensively on international organizations, international human rights, as well as international humanitarian law issues. Over the years, he has participated in several human rights missions and has been a consultant for international organizations and NGOs. He is past president of the Interdisciplinary Studies section of the ISA, as well as the past president of the Human Rights section of the American Political Science Association. Today, George will focus on the concept of a shared responsibility in refugee protection governance in light of the issues raised by the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees. George, the floor is yours, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on your time, the time zone you are in. I would like to thank Miaoling, my colleague, for taking the initiative in organizing this conversation on a very critical issue area, and of course the three sections that are co-sponsoring this event, as well as to all those who are joining us today. I would like to offer some brief thoughts on the concept of shared responsibility in the context of the adoption of the in the context of the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees, and raise some issues concerning the compact itself and challenges that we should bear in mind as we move forward. But first, let me give very briefly a few figures indicating the enormity of the refugee problem. According to data from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and these data are effective June 2025, more than 117 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, of conflict, of violence, or other human rights violations. Out of these, 42.5 million are refugees and 6.86 million are asylum seekers. That brings us a total of almost 50 million, or approximately 42% of all the displaced persons are refugees and asylum seekers. Now, move very quickly on the issue of the Global Compact and the concept of shared responsibility. The concept of shared responsibility gained renewed urgency during the large-scale displacement movements of the mid-2010s, particularly in relation to the Syrian conflict and broader regional instability. Some scholars have characterized this period as revealing systematic failures in responsibility allocation within the global north. In 2016, to start with the developments, the more immediate developments that led to the adoption of the Global Compact of Refugees, the UN General Assembly adopted the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. And this marked a political commitment to develop a more predictable and equitable framework for responsibility sharing. The declaration's language, I would argue, pointed to the lack of a firm commitment by member states and did not contain any references to accountability mechanisms or targets to be met. However, it did pave the way for negotiations that led to the adoption of the Global Compact on refugees, as well as the Global Compact on migration, and both were adopted by the UN General Assembly in December 2018. The compact is not legally binding. It is a soft law instrument that is grounded on a political commitment, but embedded also in existing international refugee law and international human rights law. Some have argued that it is a reflection of global governance through compacts, basically a normative consolidation of initiatives without, of course, a formal process of legalizations. And here is one of the first criticisms that is usually raised about the Global Compact, that it is a soft law instrument rather than a legally binding instrument. However, I do not think that we should be pushing this argument too far, because a lot of things have developed over the years in several issues areas and commitments consolidated through soft law creation. And it is also important to remember that legally binding instruments have their own problems. In particular, there are many states, or at least a considerable number of states, that don't sign and ratify these instruments. The other, of course, problem with legally binding instruments is that states can always attach ratification. So it is kind of important to, when the question is raised, there is a problem with the fact that it is not a legally binding instrument. It is a problem, but on the other hand, realize that there are problems also if we pursue the route of legally binding instruments. And we have seen that with legally binding instruments that remains unimplementable. Now, the Global Compact of Refugees articulates 4 core objectives: ease pressure on host countries, enhance refugees' self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions, and support conditions in countries of origins for safe and dignified return. And this concept the compact actually has reinvigorated the discussion about responsibility sharing, although it is not the only concept that it is used. In fact, repeatedly, if you look at the content, it goes at both burden sharing and responsibility sharing. But the introduction also responsibility sharing is considered as some considerable normative revolution in the sense, or evolution in the sense that it tries to shift the discourse from being exclusively on burden sharing, because the criticism is that burden sharing indicates that the refugees in question are a burden to the society in which they are located, as opposed to responsibility sharing, which points towards communal obligations or undertakings in order to try to do something with a group of people that can potentially and actually end up offering a lot in the communities in which they are located. And the concept of shared responsibility can be conceptualized in three different ways. One way to look at shared responsibility is kind of the distributive justice model, in which you allocate refugees according to certain indicators like capacity, GDP, population size, or historical contribution to displacement. You can see through the lens of a collection action model, which basically looks at shared responsibility as a way to induce cooperation among key actors in order to overcome free rider dynamics. And then there is a solidarity kind of based approach / model to look at shared responsibility, which indicates a normative commitment which is rooted in international community values. In fact, I would argue that although at least in two of these three, there are elements that make them consistent with international human rights norms and standards, clearly the last one, the solidarity-based model, is the one that is more reflective of human rights and humanitarian norms. In fact, some states have argued before international fora like the UN General Assembly or the Third Committee of the General Assembly that by adhering to the Refugee Convention and taking refugees, countries are fulfilling their obligations erga omnes. So the idea basically is that to be receptive of refugees, those in need, they are fleeing their country because of all of persecution, of different types of persecution and fear, is kind of an example of states living up to an obligation that they have against vis-a-vis the whole international community. For example, countries like Zambia and Jordan have made this argument. Now, the Global Refugee Forum also, there are many issues that has brought to the table. I'll highlight a couple. The fact that it emphasizes very much the multi-actor governance formats, that is, not only states are responsible for refugees, but international organizations, international financial institutions, society, local authorities, development actors, the private sector, and the academy, and also faith-based institutions. It also integrates humanitarian and development paradigms. And this has been demonstrated, for example, has been reflected in a study that was done by the International Labour Organization and UNHCR on the humanitarian development nexus, in which basically they did a review and mapping of market-led approaches in forced development contexts. However, although it has brought forward the conversation and has created also certain fora, follow-up fora, like every 4 years, meetings of state of all those who are part of the compact to discuss, assess products, and set new goals, so on and so forth. I would like to spend the rest of my presentation on addressing certain concerns that the Global Compact has raised that I think are important to bear in mind as we move forward. And the first one, of course, is that the failure to establish binding operational mechanisms that would guarantee fairer contribution from UN members towards refugee protection. The other issue is the way that it understands or in the compact and articulates the conditions at the country of origin. The Global Compact on paragraph 87 notes, and I recognize, and I quote, it is recognized that voluntary repatriation is not necessarily conditioned on the accomplishments of political solutions in the country of origin, in order not to impede the exercise of the right of refugees to return to their own country. This is a very problematic provision, because what it basically says is that refugees can be repatriated even if the conditions that led to their displacement in the first place are not addressed, are not adequately addressed. And that obviously can open the door to violations of one of the fundamental norms in the Refugee Convention, which a lot of scholars, and I include myself in that list, have argued that the non-refoulement norm is a rule of customary. The principle of non-refoulement is a rule of customary international law. And of course, we've had incidents in which this has happened in the past. One of course, the most noticeable example is what happened to the Rohingyas when they were repatriated from Bangladesh to Burma in 1994. You had a situation there in which the UNHCR claimed, after having done a study of the refugees in the camp, that they were prepared to return to Burma, while one of the Médecins Sans Frontières groups, Médecins Sans Frontières Holland, did during the same period a similar study and surveyed actually refugees in the camp, and they found out that this was not the case. And some analysts, by the way, have explained that behavior of UNHCR as an indication of UNHCR having adopted a culture of repatriation at the expense of refugee protection. And unfortunately, the language in the Global Compact leaves open the possibility of this happening again. Another issue of concern is the issue of the role of regional and sub-regional groups, which is left rather undeveloped in the compact. True, there can be important partners, regional and sub-regional groups, but also they can create obstacles in developing comprehensive responses to refugee protection. For example, if you look at countries in the European Union and North America, who with their externalization policies have confined refugees to other regional spaces. There is an accountability deficit in the compact because the compact lacks binding targets or contacts. There is no corrective mechanism when pledges fall short. Monitoring frameworks exist, but compliance, of course, depends on political will. Another problem with the compact is that it is entirely non-political in nature. At least that's what it is stated clearly in the compact in paragraph 5. And of course, when somebody reads that, says, really? Non-political? I mean, if you look at the origins of the refugee regime, it was very political. The refugee regime was very political at its creation. If you look at the Refugee Convention, there's the initial, of course, text in 1951, before it was amended with the 1967 protocol, confined actually refugees, those that were fleeing actually Europe and in events that have happened before 1951. Primarily, it was an instrument to offer refugee protection to those that are fleeing communist regimes, but there were refugees in other parts of the world that did not get the attention that their plight deserved. Of course, subsequently, UNHCR was instrumental in expanding its mandate in other regions and even incorporating in its work the plight of internally displaced persons in the 1990s. But the point here is to claim that an entity, a document that tries to resolve issues is non-political in nature is absurd, because the refugee issue is deeply political, has been political since its inception, and the only thing that we need to look at, actually somebody needs to go no further than look at how the migration/refugee issue has become a toxic issue in the politics of many countries in the global north, but not only in the global north, North America or in Europe. So to try to develop a document that will address this issue in the midst of such toxicity that surrounds displacement issues, and then claim that we are going to do that through a non-political document, is a little bit like burying your head in the sand and not trying to confront the reality. Actually, a document needs to take into consideration how deeply political the refugee issue is and try to provide solutions taking that into consideration. The other big, I think I'm approaching the end of my remarks, so I'll try to wrap up. The last thing I would like to bring as a concern is that the compact, when it talks about the root causes, and this is important, the root causes of the refugee problem that need to be addressed. However, if you look at the phrasing within the document, the root causes argument is presented purely within a domestic context. That is, the idea is that international community member states should help states that are having displacement issues, provide them support, assistance, financial, technical, and so on and so forth, to for example, deal with violent situations that lead to displacement. What is problematic about this phrasing is that it misses, is silence about the responsibility of external actors for having contributed to refugee outflows in countries that are facing displacement. And this has been pointed out also by several scholars, especially from the Global South, and rightly so. There is a certain silence there. If somebody wants to address the root causes, for example, of the Syrian crisis, of course, somebody cannot ignore and should place a lot of emphasis of the brutality of the the Assad regime. But you cannot not take into consideration the role that actions, for example, by Russia, actions by Iran, actions by the United States, actions by the United Kingdom played in the generation of refugee flows. Okay, so a discussion, and why is this appropriate? Because when we talk about the idea of accountability, we need to take into consideration accountability for all actors who, with their actions, contributed to the refugee problem that the international community is trying to address. It would be kind of ironic, for example, of a country like Russia say, or provide financial assistance now, let's say, hypothetically speaking, to country X, nor deal with refugees, but stay out of any conversation about Russia's own activities in having contributed to the refugee flows. And one other additional remark that I would like to make in this context before concluding is that if, as we go forward and trying to make the Global Compact more effective as a forum for discussion, deliberation, and proposals for dealing with the refugee issue, I think it will be important to draw also upon a principle which is from the environmental law context, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities as a guidance for state action. Now, this principle recognizes that states have contributed, I mean, in the environmental law context, to different degrees and have varying capacities to address them. In the refugee law context, the discussion so far has those, for example, who have advocated drawing on that concept and bringing it into the refugee law conversation. This, so far, the principle has focused on the latter, according to some analysts. That is, according to some analysts, but that is challenged by several scholars, including myself, for downplaying the role of developed countries in the generation of refugee flows, as I indicated before. So a critical reading of the principle, I would argue, would necessitate integrating a culpability-related conception of shared responsibility into our understanding of it. So when we think in terms of how we implement shared responsibility of the context of refugee flows, we should not only think in terms of the responsibility of states to provide, for example, financial assistance to countries that are facing the refugee problem or technical assistance, but we should factor into the conversation the culpability of states who, by their actions, may have contributed in this, and take that into consideration as we are allocating responsibility and, of course, the amount of resources that need to be devoted in addressing this issue. So I would strongly urge on the need to integrate, as I said before, a culpability-related conception of shared responsibility into our understanding, drawing from the conversation on the common but differentiated responsibility used in the context of climate change. So, to conclude, I would argue that the central challenge for the coming decade will be whether this ethic of shared responsibility, despite its challenges and the problems, can evolve into a more predictable and equitable allocation mechanism that will incorporate a culpability-related conception of shared responsibility, or whether responsibility will continue to be shared rhetorically, globally, but concentrated geographically. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. You have raised lots of stuff and aspects, interesting aspects that we can discuss it later, and probably will be a great topic for our next webinar. Okay, we go to our next panelist, Vicky Squire. Vicky Squire, unfortunately, she cannot join us today, but just allow me to introduce her briefly, and we'll hear her recording. Vicky is professor of international politics at the Department of Politics and International Studies, University of Warwick, UK. She has over 20 years of experience of research with mobile and displaced communities, and is author of 7 books and over 50 articles, book chapters. Vicky has undertaken research as well as and later research projects across multiple sites and regions, including the UK, the Balkans, the Mediterranean, the Mexico-US border region, and Sub-Saharan Africa. She is currently principal investigator of the data literacies in displacement project and has just published an interesting book, Making and Unmaking Global Citizenship, published by Edinburgh University Press. So just allow me to play her video or recording. I just make it free. Wait a moment.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to participate today. And I'm sorry I can't make the revised date for this session. I'm going to speak to the questions that were raised for this series of workshops, what the limits of global responsibility towards refugees are, and how are these limits transcended at the institutional and community individual levels, so the meso and micro levels. I'm going to focus mainly on the latter aspect, in particular, some of the responses of community groups and individuals to limits of global responsibility, particularly in light of the lived experiences of hostility that people migrating under precarious conditions and their allies currently face across a range of locations. So just pleased to note that I'm not a legal scholar. I'm going to mainly refer to people in situations of precarious migration in this talk rather than refugees per se. But a key point that I want to emphasize is the importance of engaging the insights and struggles of people in situations of precarity when addressing questions of global responsibility. And despite the increased recognition of the need to include refugees, migrants as key sort of stakeholders, if you like, in discussions about precarious migration and displacement, debates have largely proceeded without the input of people who have those critical insights based on lived experiences. I think a good example here is the work that's been carried out as part of the Global Compacts on migration and refugees. From the start, there's been criticism, in particular, of the Refugee Compact, of the ways that these have excluded people with lived experience. So, for example, in December 2018, there was a migration week held in Morocco around the approval of the non-binding political agreement, the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly and Regular Migration. Concerns were raised at this time by members of various African civil society organisations about their inability to participate in these activities due to the difficulties in acquiring visas. So they issued an appeal. I'm just going to quote briefly from that, where they say, we cannot keep silent about the discrimination that Africans continue to suffer, affecting their right to mobility in their own continent. At the same time in which our European, American, and Asian colleagues use their visa waivers for Morocco to buy their airplane ticket to Marrakesh, us Africans are still in the process of waiting for the Kingdom of Morocco to decide to issue us a visa. When it comes to adopting a global compact on migration, us Africans continue to suffer security-minded policies to prevent us from moving freely in comparison with citizens from other parts of the world. So implementation activities around the Global Compact for Refugees have also been subject to similar sorts of criticism. The first Global Refugee Forum had less than 3% of the 3,000 participants as refugees. Refugee participants remained very much on the sidelines. This led to concerted efforts to improve this in the 2023 forum. There were 320 out of 4,000 participants who were refugees. Also importantly, 19% of the speakers. Representatives of the UNHCR Advisory Board of Organisations are led by forcibly displaced and stateless persons, 16 of whom advise the UNHCR on meaningful participation. They had a speech at the opening session of the forum where they highlighted the lack of voice, the lack of funding for refugee-led organisations. And there were efforts in the stated outcomes of the 2023 forum to work against this, to kind of respond to this. These emphasise refugee inclusion in financing and policy, pledges to include refugees in areas such as creating national development and climate action plans. All that said, people with lived experiences of precarious migration have nevertheless only been integrated in partial ways over time, rather than being integral to the formation and implementation of the compacts and related activities. So I think maybe one of the successful things about the Global Compact is the way that responsibility sharing has become an established discourse on the international stage and also a reference point for national debates. So in the UK, for example, we've had the rise of the far right, of course. We've had a succession of governments committed to deterrence, and but the importance of shared action remains a key reference point. In 2024, for example, the former Conservative Home Secretary, James Cleverly, suggested that the global community must take collective action on migration. The problem here, of course, is that the ways this concern with collective action is posed can often be really problematic. In the case of the former UK Conservative government, this involved payments to Rwanda to accept asylum seekers from the UK, alongside the passing of the 2023 Illegal Immigration Act, which denied the right to asylum for those entering the UK without pre-authorisation. More recently, we have seen the UK Prime Minister come together with the Danish Premier, calling for revisions to the European Court of Human Rights in order to facilitate removals and limit family reunification. And we've seen developments such as the imposition of visa restrictions for countries like Democratic Republic of Congo for failing to cooperate on returns, and other countries having to improve their migration management processes to evade such restrictions. I think the other sessions in this series have talked about resettlement. UNHCR has made efforts to advance resettlement as a key form of global responsibility sharing. In the UK, though, we've had figures come down since 2021, despite us now having a Labour government since 2024. Numbers through community sponsorships were also very low last year, only 11 in total. And we had the closure of the Afghan scheme last July, plus increased efforts to prevent family reunification, as I indicated. So these very much question the status of resettlement and the so-called safe and legal routes that the UK Home Office presents as an expression of global responsibility sharing. I think resettlement obviously is also proven limited elsewhere. EU states failing to kind of commit to resettlement quotas for UN recognised refugees has been a kind of big issue this year as well. So what alternatives arise in this context to fill the gaps in these sort of more formalised collective actions? How are the limits of global responsibility towards refugees transcended at the micro community individual levels? It's not all bad news. We have kind of recent developments such as the closure of an immigration removal centre for women in County Durham in the UK as a result of a long campaign effort highlighting the poor isolated conditions within the centre. Despite low levels of community sponsorship last year, we also have a lot of reports of successful placements, local groups, local communities embracing new arrivals, including in rural locations that are traditionally very white. We have had the criminalisation of people piloting boats coming to the fore in the UK over recent years. Earlier this year, an 18-year-old Afghan national was the first to be charged with endangering others for their role in piloting a boat across the Channel. And that's a new offence, recently came into force under the Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Act, where people face up to 6 years in prison for endangering or risking another life at sea. But in response to that, we've also seen the rise of legal and support groups such as Captain Support to kind of provide solidarity to those people accused of human smuggling. And despite the criminalisation of both migrants and activists across Europe, we also see groups such as Alarm Phone, for example, committed to working for the rights of people in situations of precarity. I also want to emphasise the important forms of mutual support that arise in these contexts. People with lived experience of precarious migration often providing forms of care and support for each other and their wider communities, and this often goes unnoticed. And we also have the rise of academic networks. I think it'd be helpful, I think, to highlight the Migration Scholars Solidarity and Resistance Network that was set up last year by Nina Glick-Schiller and Bella Feldman Bianco. But bringing the focus back to people with lived experiences of precarious migration, I think it's worth noting how actions by these groups are often more than simply fulfilling gaps in global responsibility. Many are also really deeply problematizing the relations underpinning such gaps, including definitions of who's worthy of protection, who holds the status of protector. So I think very much sort of reflecting that statement I read out earlier, around the migration week in Marrakesh, the kind of differentiated rights that were highlighted there. I've also been looking more recently at a group called the Gambian Association in Palermo, and they engage in a range of community activities with the aim of creating a sort of more healthy society, as they call it, in the locations where people arrive and are settled. This includes a range of activities, community football matches, the provision of kind of information sessions on precarious migration in local schools, work in prisons to enhance intercultural understanding between Italian inmates and prison guards with those detained, many on piloting charges, and a range of other activities. And I think that these activities, as I said, kind of need to be seen as more than simply filling the gaps in global responsibility. Underpinning these are contestations over the meaning of global responsibility and the kind of requirement for this more fundamentally. So I wanted to end by just talking about a statement by a young Gambian man who was deported from Libya in 2017. And he kind of makes a statement on a YouTube video that, again, I sort of talk about in my book, and I don't have time to go into the detail of this, but he talks about migration not being illegal, that no migrant is illegal. We all deserve to migrate, and it's our human right to migrate. But he also talks about the world not being built on migration, that, people shouldn't have to migrate if they don't want to. And this is where he brings a kind of more detailed analysis of the mobility injustices, the inequalities of contemporary global politics that drives a lot of youth migration from his country of the Gambia towards Europe. And he's talking in the context of rising deportations of migrants from the Gambia from Europe. So he emphasizes the export of key resources from Africa by foreign investors. He talks about the lack of access to regular migration routes for young Africans. He contrasts that with tourists traveling in the other direction, who he says don't contribute to the Gambia in the same way that Gambian youth often do in Europe. And he talks about the colonial legacies embedded in deportation, and the need for a current of respect between people across the globe in order to create what he calls a better world for all. So to sum up, there are indeed significant limitations to global responsibility. Of course, there's a lot of work being done on the global scene to sort of work to counteract that. But in terms of a bottom-up or micro-scale analysis, there is a lot of work that exposes and problematizes those limits of global responsibility, not only in terms of host community or activist solidarity work, but also in terms of the actions taken by people in situations of precarity. So I think paying attention to these sheds important light on the need for, of course, more far-reaching change, also to some of the ways that change is already being enacted on the ground. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Vicky. It's an excellent presentation. I love it. And this is a great connection we can see between George as well as Vicky's presentation talking about a global compact at a normative level as well as implementation level. Now we are switching to our third panelist. So, which Henry Chip Carey, who unfortunately cannot join us today, but he also has sent us his recording timely. And just allow me to introduce him briefly and what he's going to talk about. Chip is editor-in-chief, Journal of International Organization Studies. He is based on Department of Political Science at Georgia State University. His presentation today addresses the mobility gaps for migration by discussing the interdiction of Haitian and Cubans by the U.S. Coast Guard since the late 1980s, which then has evolved into the more recent Trump-approved armed attacks on alleged drug traffickers and the adoption of the Venezuelan head of the state happening in the first months of this year. Then we can now hear his recording. Please, Joel, if you can just show us Chip's recording. Thank you.
Hi, this is Chip Carey speaking. I'm at Georgia State University. I'm an outgoing chair of the International Law section of International Studies Association. And today I'm going to talk about how the Haitian boat people interdiction policy of the Reagan administration in the 1980s has evolved to cut off the mobility of all boat people in the Caribbean Sea, heading toward the United States with one or two exceptions a year, reaching the United States, and forced those people to have to try to go through the Darien Gap from Haiti and other Caribbean islands, or from South America into Panama from Colombia and up through the southwest border, to the point where people seeking asylum have had to apply on an app that was created by the Biden administration or apply from a consulate in their country. And I will trace the other restrictions the Biden administration made to make it even more restrictive than had occurred, beginning with the Reagan administration, and then conclude with a discussion of the Trump administration's policies to not only cut off mobility, but also to detain and remove illegal people from the United States, as well as to attack boats at sea for alleged drug trafficking, for carrying petroleum that is supposedly prevented by sanction regime established by the United States, and to remove the head of state of the country of Venezuela. And this is all based on the original idea that the U.S. jurisdiction does not extend beyond its borders, and basically we can do whatever we want as the United States beyond where our Constitution does not govern, that is at the high seas beyond the U.S. territorial sea. This was a position that is ironic because the current administration under Trump has asserted, in the name of enforcing the law, a number of these actions that I earlier alluded to on the legitimacy of extending legal enforcement from the United States borders to the high seas and to Venezuela itself. To say that it's inconsistent and also clearly and unambiguously violation of international law is obvious. In these more recent developments, there's no state of war between the United States and Venezuela. There's no state of war with alleged drug traffickers trying to get in the United States. So far, the drug traffickers don't have their own navy or army, which might conceivably make it possible. And the idea that petroleum sanctions in the United States from Venezuela would justify the capture now of 7 oil tankers from Venezuela, as well as capturing the head of state of Venezuela when there's no state of war, is certainly an odd formulation of extension of jurisdiction beyond the U.S. borders, when previously the Bush administration had allowed torture to be occurred on Guantanamo because it was beyond U.S. borders. That was struck down by U.S. courts in saying that these individuals cannot be tortured. But the policy was ended by Obama, at least officially in name, if not in practice. And so it never got fully litigated. We also had earlier episodes, Judge Sterling Johnson halted the policy of interdicting Haitian boat people under the Reagan-Duvalier Pact of the 1980s that allowed the Coast Guard to go into the Haitian Territorial Sea and violate Haitian sovereignty, as well as the high seas of the customary law of freedom of the seas, plus the customary law that emerged since the Refugee Protocol was established, that people could go to another country, and it didn't matter how they got there. They could stay so long as they had a well-founded fear of persecution. The United States ratified that protocol, and it's been accepted by many countries as binding under customary international law. So how do we get to this situation in the first place? So there was a surge of Haitian boat people when a number of policies, many of them fostered by the United States, made Haitian agriculture dysfunctional. The United States dumped rice in the Food for Peace program in Haiti. This got most attention during the Clinton administration, but it's a policy that dated to the PL 480 Food for Peace Foreign Aid Program, where you put the local farmers out of business because people can get rice, the so-called Miami rice after the TV show Miami Vice, put Haitian farmers out of business, and the rural countryside was first moving into the cities in great numbers and then took the high seas to try to reach the United States, as only the Haitian elite had done during the Papa Doc period. Baby Doc was the ruler who made the pact in the 80s with Ronald Reagan that had a status in international law as a binding treaty, but which is not a treaty under U.S. constitutional law because it was never submitted to the U.S. Senate. But it clearly has binding status even in U.S. jurisdiction because it was an executive agreement between two heads of state. And the actual idea that a treaty is not binding unless it's submitted to the Senate for advice and consent is not taken seriously by any lawyer. Over time, we see these restrictions being extremely effective. As I mentioned, only one or two boats every year or two get through from Haiti to the United States now, this being 40 years after this Reagan-Duvalier Pact that allowed the U.S. to violate Haitian sovereignty. The pact was renounced by Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was deposed in the coup of September 29, 1991, and was in exile for 1,111 days. He wasn't in power much longer, but after the U.S. returned him under the legal authority of the UN Security Councils in an armed attack that was not a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, because it was authorized by the Security Council in a decision with at least 9 votes and no veto, we had a situation where Aristide, as head of state, renounced the Duvalier-Reagan Pact. The United States paid no attention to it, and as a practical matter, giving Haiti enormous amounts of foreign aid. In the 90s, it was $150 million a year in foreign aid, which was much more than most countries get per capita, or even absolutely. Obviously, there are a few major exceptions like Egypt, Pakistan, Israel, and Afghanistan, when they are key foreign policy goals of the United States. Nicaragua, immediately after the electoral defeat of the Sandinistas in 1990, was another huge recipient of hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid. But that ended there. Haiti got as much as $400 or $500 million from the United States at its peak period, and there was no way U.S. presidents, whether Democratic or Republican, would allow this aid to continue if the Coast Guard couldn't continue to grab boats in the Haitian Territorial Sea or in the Caribbean, destroy the boats, and return the people on board back to the United States. This is quite the opposite from the European policies, which the Italian Navy played a heroic role in saving boats that were capsizing, shipping off from Tunisia heading towards southern Italy. Similarly, the Greeks initially were quite hospitable towards those Syrians that had fled from Turkey into Greece. But then there was a $6 billion EU deal to pay Turkey basically to keep the boat people from going to Greece and towards Europe if they took that foreign aid. So you have this situation where Europe has changed its policies quite remarkably, and now you do have some countries more open than others. The great generous recipients, Sweden and especially Germany, who took 1 million Syrians during Angela Merkel's chancellorship, I should say, was partly the result of Germany's coming to grips with its history and trying to prove that the Holocaust and similar acts, while not defensible in any extraordinary way, at least could be expiated a little bit by taking on humanitarian actions. And in this case, it was also augmented by an iconic photograph of a Syrian baby that had died on a Greek shore trying to flee from Greece, ultimately from the Syrian conflict that her parents removed her from. A similar iconic photograph in Del Rio, Texas, where anywhere from 25,000 or so Haitian boat people were congregated as land people because the only boat trip they took was from Haiti to Venezuela, or perhaps an airplane ticket to get to South America, where they'd spent 10 years working until they were summarily exiled or removed from every country in the Southern Cone except Chile. Ecuador was relatively nice, but certainly Brazil and Argentina in particular tried to get rid of these Haitians, and the Haitians had to go northbound on foot for the most part, cross the Darien Gap, across on another boat, and eventually through Guatemala into Mexico and congregated in the city of Del Rio. And in Biden's first year in office in 2021, it became a big scandal. The Trump government had just left power, but the MAGA base was mobilized, and many types of epithets were hurled towards Haitians. 4 years later, they said the Haitians were eating the cats and dogs, which was a lie about a town in Ohio. But that didn't stop J.D. Vance from repeating the lie, fully cognizant that it wasn't true, and didn't even admit an error after it was shown that there was no evidence that this was taking place. The iconic photograph in Del Rio, Texas, was of a Customs Border Patrol agent on horseback whipping what looks like a Haitian who had walked to the border and evoked images of slavery and whipping people. The National Guard was originally created in the United States to control runaway slaves. And so Biden immediately changed his plans to deport all the Haitians in Del Rio back to Haiti. The ones who did get deported in the first week or so before the policy got fully implemented were not returned back from Haiti, but the others were given some kind of parole to apply for asylum. Some were forced to remain on the Mexican side of the border, but were promised an interview for a credible fear hearing. Others got into the United States with an ankle bracelet and had their credible fear hearing. And over the 4 years of the Biden administration, there was a policy for Haiti and a number of other countries, because of humanitarian emergencies, to parole them to be allowed to stay in the country until it was safe to go back. Those policies have been largely eliminated by the Trump administration, and Haitians are due to lose their temporary protective status in a matter of a couple of weeks from now. They had a number of one-year extensions, so it did extend throughout the Biden administration and into the Trump administration. So how did we get to this situation today where the Trump administration can essentially, in a criminal law context, without an armed conflict, without the application of humanitarian law, and therefore no authorization to attack ships, decide that it can attack ships? I think this is the idea that stems not directly, but indirectly and continuously from the Haitian interdiction policy, which held until Judge Johnson ruled that these interdicted Haitian people, boat people during the Aristide exile, were at least entitled to a due process hearing in immigration court. And one was set up on the Guantanamo Detention Center that preceded the 9/11 Guantanamo Detention Center for Al-Qaeda and other jihadi terrorist groups. This, from the 1991 to 1994 exile Aristide regime, did lead to a change from 1% of the people who had asylum hearings on the Coast Guard ships to about 2/3 of those on Guantanamo being granted political asylum because they had a well-founded fear of persecution. But that decision by Judge Johnson, which was not reviewed and overturned by a circuit court or by the United States Supreme Court, now has a court which is largely supportive based on the immediate resolutions on the shadow docket, which is not technically on the merits, but seems to be indicating that Trump's immigration policy is going to continue. The only cases in doubt right now for the U.S. Supreme Court seem to be questions about birthright citizenship and unilateral imposition of tariffs by Donald Trump, but everything else on the temporary shadow docket has reversed the temporary restraining order imposed by the lower courts, which ruled against the Trump administration on every one of these practically immigration issues except one, which was on a technical point, but not on the merits. The idea that law does not apply at the high seas is erroneous. International law governs the relation between countries and is designed to regulate routine relationships, which are classically the ability to travel, the ability to buy things on the internet, the ability to present a passport and maintain contact with people and so on and so forth. And there's no idea that there's no law of the sea. We have a treaty of which the United States has not ratified, but it's accepted all but the deep seabed mining section of that long, massive law of the sea treaty as binding under customary international law. So the official position of the U.S. government still is that the United States believes in the rule of law on the high seas, just as it believes in it in laws among countries in the world. And it's a shame, in my humble opinion, that the United States is now in a situation where, because it is a dualist country and treaties are not automatically binding in U.S. courts unless they've been affected into U.S. statutory law that creates a basis for litigation in U.S. courts, that most of these treaties will not get litigated. It just so happens that the Refugee Protocol has been executed into U.S. statutory law, and just waiting to see whether any court will say that the provisions of the Refugee Protocol do not make it criminal, certainly, and not illegal to present yourself to apply asylum inside the United States if you cross the border. It doesn't look like that's even a case that will have any chance of being respected, despite decades of the orthodox interpretation that we've had, that people have the right to apply for asylum. As far as migrants are concerned who don't have a well-founded fear of persecution, it always has been illegal to cross the border for that purpose, but it was never meant to be criminal because it's quite possible they have a right to apply for asylum. Now it's been criminalized under the Trump administration, first Trump administration. A number of states have made it a crime under state law. And so and people get detained and prosecuted, as opposed to detained and then scheduled, if they have a credible fear of persecution, to have a case in immigration court if they've come into the country illegally. Otherwise, you have to do it from the border, and then you'd have an administrative procedure through credible fear hearings by the Department of Homeland Security. And those hearings theoretically are on the same legal criteria as a defensive action before an immigration court. That too has been restricted Also, the immigration judges have resigned or have been removed in huge numbers. If as Article 2 courts, the president regards these judges as serving him in the same way that he doesn't believe that the Federal Reserve Board has autonomy and that he can't fire anyone he wants to on the Federal Reserve Board or any judge on the immigration court. It doesn't decide cases on the way he likes to see them, which is to say, always deny. There always was a tremendous disparity among the 11 circuits of the United States, with Georgia and the Southeast Circuit about 2% of applicants are granted asylum, whereas in Northern California, 60, 70% approval ratings. And that was an oddity that always existed because the Supreme Court, until recently, never took immigration cases. I think they only took one in most of its history. And therefore, these inconsistencies were allowed to remain, even though that's normally a basis for a writ of certiorari for a final decision by the Supreme Court. Okay, thanks very much. And I open to you contacting me if you have any questions. Chip Carey from Georgia State University. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief. Although you are not here, but it's also excellent presentation. Crossing, going back to historical stories and demonstrate how refugee protections we have really a huge vacuum in higher sea to address lower sport people their protection. I think now is the time. You see, we have really very, very scarce time for our discussion as well as discussions. Therefore, Q&A. Therefore, I would suggest if you can, Alexandria as well as Hans, just try your best to make several interesting points what the discussion or the panelists have raised as the issues, and then we can go back to George and also to the broader audience. Alexandria, please.
Thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you, George. It's such an interesting talk. I mean, thanks also to Vicky and Chip, but they're not here to hear my thanks. And so, George, you may get charged with responding to all the questions. I'll try and keep it very brief. Well, I guess all speakers really focused in on this idea of responsibility in different ways, like where we see the limits of global responsibility to refugees. And George discussed the limitations of the Global Compact on refugees in enforcing or requiring shared responsibility in practice. And I think, one of the things that maybe we should talk about more, and I think you touched on this as well, is sort of to whom responsibility is for. So when we're framing this responsibility as the responsibility to refugees themselves, which is what, I default would always think it should be. But then, as you mentioned, there was this sort of problematic language of burden sharing, and that frames the responsibility as responsibility to other states, which sort of maybe diverts what what we would hope for in terms of thinking through responsibility and being able to support refugees. The themes of responsibility from the other two speakers, I guess Chip pointed to a worrying contraction in legal responsibility where the US isn't meeting obligations under the refugee protocol and is even in direct contravention of them by intercepting boats on the high seas. And then Vicky discussed as well these gaps in global responsibility. And I think there was this intersection as well with what you said, George, in terms of how those gaps are unequally arranged. So inequality really remains at the center of global immigration governance. And I think, I would link this to what you said, George, about the silence on root causes. Vicky talked about it a little bit in the context of like the global distribution of wealth or the global distribution of power and how visas are distributed and that sort of thing. But I think these things are all linked. And again, is one of the things we should be focusing on. And I guess the thing that I would maybe bring to the discussion as well, which I guess is relevant for all three speakers in some way, but is to focus a little bit on the migration journey. Because there was these examples of how the migration journey has been criminalized. And, this isn't really news. It's been going on. It's been becoming increasingly more criminalized over the last couple of decades. And just a word on terminology as well. I'm saying sort of refugee, but I'm referring broadly. I think there's a gap when we talk about refugees and responsibility to refugees. Refugee is a status that's acquired, but this, in using the terminology, if we're only referring to that status, we're sort of replicating the gap because, of course, to seek asylum or to seek refugee status is protected. And that was also addressed in Chip's discussion as well. So this is protected while you're seeking, but you don't have the official status as refugee. Vicky mentioned the language of precarious and insecure immigration statuses as well. These all involve experiences of hardship, violence, persecution, and should be integrated into ideas of responsibility towards refugees.
Yeah.
So going back to what I was saying, again, I'm trying to be as quick as possible. But when we think about the journey, to undertake a journey to seek asylum or to request refugee status, this is protected in customary international law. It's protected in the law that, signatories have signed in the Refugee Convention, the Refugee Protocol, in terms of this non-refoulement. And so obviously there are people who might request refugee status when they're already in a state, but the Refugee Convention is designed to also protect people from suffering violence and persecution within their home state. And so this idea of making a migration journey is part and parcel of being a refugee. So it's not just people who already have the status. And I may be liberal at this point, but I think it's really important because in terms of being able to travel and acquire visas, options are very, very limited, and they've become increasingly more limited over the last few decades, which means a lot of people are sort of forced into unauthorized journeys, irregular immigration routes. And I think I very strongly agree with what George said, that these questions are all political, and the governance of the immigration journey is part of the limitation of responsibility towards refugees, and it's very, very political. So we've seen the systematic criminalization of people who travel without documents. This, for many people, is the only option, the only way that they can travel. And I think the limitation on global responsibility to support people who need to make a journey to travel to seek and acquire refugee status is very far-reaching in both extent and implications. So making an undocumented migration journey is very well evidenced to include a high risk of violence. Violence has physical and mental health implications that last far longer than the event of violence itself. There's very robust evidence of organized and systematized violence, including violence perpetrated by states against people who are traveling undocumented immigration routes. And so I think one way to think about responsibility, we need to think about it as more far-reaching than legal responsibility, which is both limited and limits in itself. Kind of in the naming, in definitions, is often limits. And I think as long as the state is predisposed towards migrants and refugees as being a problem that needs to be solved, we'll continue to see this violence. And the law has not been particularly effective in limiting state violence towards migrants or limiting state appropriation of the violence of other actors. Rather, it's been used to delimit access to states that are controlling refugee and migrant entries, and in doing so, authorize the use of state violence towards those who fall outside of these often quite arbitrary legal limits. So I think one thing we need to really do is think about the best ways to contest these limits, to find ways to prevent violence, to provide people with recourse to protection from violence, and to support those who are at risk of violence. And one thing that really stands out to me is this sort of gap or lack when it comes to the migration journey. And I think one thing that we should be thinking about is how we can recognize persecution on the journey, persecution that starts when somebody is outside of their home country but is on a journey to seek asylum status, how we can recognize that type of persecution as also being covered by the law of non-refoulement, because we see states all the time removing people to third countries, what are sort of said to be safe third countries. But often if people are being removed to what is said to be a safe third country and are being removed there without having a specified immigration status in that country, they're being removed to situations of violence that's being perpetrated by actors at the state is unwilling or unable to control. And so I think that's where I'll end it. I hope there's some food for thought in there at least. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Andre. Lots of things to talk about. Yeah. Hans, it's your turn, please.
Great. Thanks very much, Miao-Ling, and thanks, Andre, my colleague, in organizing the webinars, and to our panelists today, especially to George, whose talk I thought was really very close to the heart of the overall purpose of having these webinars, this whole series that focus more on the theme of global responsibility. I want to be very short because we only have 11 minutes left in this webinar, so I'll just briefly bring into the picture here what I think is a catastrophe, really, that's been happening in the US since Donald Trump became the president for the second time. And this is something we haven't really confronted head on in this webinar series, and I can't really do it justice in a couple of minutes either. But I just want to make the point, when we talk about precarity of human beings or violence against immigrants, that in a sense in the US right now, I think everybody is precarious, not only immigrants, but also citizens, the way that the Trump administration is attacking the rule of law and using immigration as a wedge point, especially to do so. One thing we've seen in the US is that the border is everywhere. Now, total deportations in the US for 2025 were roughly the same as they were in 2024. But removal of immigrants from inside the country itself, rather than turning away immigrants at the border, that has gone up dramatically. And in the debates surrounding quote, immigration enforcement in the US, specifically ICE, the agency that has, as you've probably seen in the news, has turned into kind of a lawless rogue militia of sorts, really acting at the behest of the executive, the president, really, but as part of the executive branch, or rogue executive branch, I would say. I think in the debates, even critics of ICE have focused too much on training people. They're saying the people who are committing violence against both immigrants and citizens are not trained properly or not vetted properly, but actually the whole system itself and the cruelty and evil that really goes with it is the heart of the problem. There's been too much deference in American public debate to immigration enforcement, or deference to that, without enough attention to the well-being of immigrants themselves, and also, as discussed by the speakers today, the benefits of immigration, the contributions that immigrants bring to countries, which actually is very powerful, a very powerful reason to encourage solidarity across the immigration advocacy movement. In the US, it took brutal murders, really executions of 2 US citizens in Minnesota, for people to wake up, in a sense. I mean, talk about precarity here, when people just exercising their civil liberties and documenting protests and being present at immigration enforcements themselves get killed. I mean, that's what I mean by nobody being safe from the potential for state violence now in the US. And I think to an extent, the suffering of immigrants and their families, and the toll that Trump's policies have had breaking up families and disrupting people that may have made an authorized entry into the US, but otherwise were living peacefully and contributing to their communities, not breaking any laws, living legally, even if they can be easily vulnerable to vilification, is, quote, illegal. And I would subscribe to the view that no person is illegal. But the disruption that these people have gone through and the outright suffering has taken a back seat. It's not absent. If you want to find out what's going on, you can find it. Fortunately, a good number of news organizations have been documenting the atrocities that immigrants have been suffering in detention centers. We could talk about the degree that concentration camps, not just throwing people out of the country, but the extent that people are still in the country suffering in concentration camps right now. That too is a huge problem. ProPublica is one of the news organizations that's done a very good job, I think, at documenting in detail. So the public really needs to look for the atrocities. And when it comes to refugee policy, which has been very important in this webinar series, there's very little public concern, let alone outrage, over the total shutdown of refugee intake in the US, and also the perversion of refugee law in the US, simply to help, quote, white nationalists, from my point of view, taking in South Africans, white South Africans, but denying it to pretty much everybody else that would be eligible as a refugee. And furthermore, George talked about non-refoulement as a key aspect of refugee policy, but the US has been, really carrying refoulement to extremes this past year, especially the way it was moving to throw out Afghan refugees. I mean, if you're throwing out Afghan refugees that actually have worked with the US military in 2 decades of US occupation there, if you can't even keep those, who else are you going to, who else is vulnerable? I mean, we could talk about the hate mongering and outright lies that targeted the Haitian population in Springfield, Ohio, or the Somali communities in Minnesota as well. But a couple of just larger points I want to make before just returning this back to the floor. One is that if this all amounts to global far-right politics, and as George said, it is deeply and obviously political, what we see in the contentious politics of immigration, refugees and beyond, is that the far right is organizing transnationally. Ironically so, they're adopting a lot of the transnational social movement strategies that we saw used primarily by progressive critics of economic globalization 20 years ago. The far right has figured that playbook out. Where is the global justice movement at this point in time? It needs a rebirth, and that is something for us all to be thinking about here. For the moment, I think the most powerful resistance we're seeing in many countries, certainly the US, is in domestic arenas, especially with the domestic courts. In the US, the domestic courts have been very important in limiting damage at the very least. Again, picking up on Andre's comments about state violence, it's not just against immigrants, it's about citizens too. And the courts have been very important in turning this back, but that's not enough. I think I know that civil liberties groups in the US and immigration advocacy groups and so forth, and this is true for many democracies where immigrants are under threat. It's excellent that we've had this mobilization. We've had all the lawsuits that have limited or contained some of the damage, if not all of it. But I think what's going to have to happen going forward is a lot of the activist movements and legal networks that have been working to stop harm within nation states. We're going to have to be the ones, I think, who try to carry the fight to bring about a greater sense of shared responsibility internationally, and hopefully eventually progress from fighting the harm that's happening within particular countries to trying to mobilize together to do more good worldwide. I'll leave it there. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you, Hans. Thank you very much for discussions, comments, and further observations. Great. I think we really have scarcely time. I would say, George, would you like to respond briefly to Andrew's comments, and then probably we can just pick up one question from the audience, and then that is what we can do now. Okay, please, George, if you like.
First of all, I want to thank both Alexandria and Hans for their very thoughtful comments. I don't have time to comment on all the things that they raise, so I would pick just a couple. It is very important, the point that Alexandria raised concerning the protection throughout the route. This is something that does not receive the attention that it merits, and it is very consistent with the object and purpose of the Refugee Convention, because some of the criticisms have been when you reach the end of the trip in the place where you'd like to apply for asylum, and then that country prevents you from even reaching its shores by externalization policies. But what about the brutalization that you are subjected to until you reach that point in which you are shipped back? And this really merits more attention by member states, as well as civil society organizations. And I would say that the protection of the route is part and parcel of the refugee regime. So I'm glad that this point has been raised, and we need to focus more attention on this. Very quickly on one of the comments that Hans made, and I'm glad that he made that, one of the things that we're seeing in Trump 2.0 is the attention more in the interior of the country. And I think one of the reasons that the brutalization of ICE tactics have received so much attention is exactly because of their shift in strategy to not focus only on the border, but go after sanctuary cities. And one of the usual, and I think this is going to get only worse, concerning the argument that it is being raised by several critics of ICE, one of the arguments that part of the problem lies with the fact that they are in the rush to get more people out. They are cutting down on training time in order to be able to get them to the front lines, and some attention. And I see also in the questioning last week before Congress of the acting director of ICE from the Department of Homeland Security, when he was asked repeatedly how many weeks do training and where and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think this is a misplaced focus, because the problem, yes, they are not trained as they used to be, but the brutalization of the tactics that we are witnessing has less to do with less time for training and the culture, the prevailing culture that exists at ICE. Because if you look also at the behavior of ICE during Trump #1, when the issue of training, the shortage of training was not such a big issue, you saw a lot of abuse even during that period. By the way, also during previous administration. The reason I think that we're getting more attention now is not because we have less trained people in the street, but because the strategy is shifting in the interior, in the cities, and what we see a collapse in the distinction between migrants/refugees, permanent residents, and citizens who are being brutalized. This is not a lack of training. This is the prevailing culture within ICE that is, in my view, the major contributing factor. So even if we were to go back, basically the argument I'm trying to make is that, and of course, this of course needs to be tested, but I would venture that even if we're to go back to proper training and lengthy, you are not going to see less of that behavior of ICE agents, because they have shifted the strategies towards sanctioned cities. And this is the problem, the big problem there. Not, of course, that they were not brutalizing migrants and refugees at the border, but now by focusing in the interior, what you see is that the lines and distinctions between migrants, refugees, permanent residents, citizens is collapsing. And basically anything that stands in ICE's way is going to be handled with levels of violence and brutality that are reminiscent basically of regimes that the United States traditionally would like to be less associated with. We're talking about Lukashenko type of regime behavior, Maduro's Venezuela, Iran regime, the way they are clamping down on dissent in the big cities. I mean, you see images in the United States now that you could easily say are coming from other countries in the world, with regimes where the rule of law and any restrictions on abusive conduct by the executive arm of the government has totally collapsed. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to close our webinars with some, it's all the comments and reveal a very troubling and worrying tendency of what's currently going on. And in other words, as Hans just mentioned, there are lots of stuff to talk, and for us as academics to get involved and to uncover and to document and to analyze those gaps, and to for particularly important to integrate, to consider, relocate, redefine the global responsibility as a discourse. And in other words, our discussion will continue, and there is a huge text ahead of us, not only at the academic level, but also at activism to resist this unparalleled challenge ahead of us. Thank you very much, the audience. Great to have all of you. And as said, our seminar is recorded, so you can have them not only for today's webinar, but also from our previous part 1 as well as part 2. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your great comments, and then see you perhaps soon we will do our best. See you. Bye.